One of the next developments we want to take a look at in the early medieval world is going to be the rise of the urban centers, also with universities, and some concepts of higher education. This picture is depicting an early corporation, an early a group of university professors who think of themselves as a united guild, as a separate entity, as a corporation within the educational system of Europe. They see themselves as self-governing, self-regulatory, like many of the other guilds that were living in many different cities, right? They had sort of incorporated themselves and purchased their freedom to operate, and they're going to be spreading across Europe. And maybe in your textbook, the one that you're using, you'll see that there's a rise of universities at various time periods, especially in the 13th century, as there is a need for higher education for the purposes especially of government and church service. But this is showing the sort of highly stylized manner by which many early universities were created, and they were, of course, very jealous of maintaining their independence, and that maintains itself to this day. The key element here is that education at the highest levels was only open to a very narrow sector of men. Men of great intellectual talent, but also men from the highest echelons of society, the highest elite people who wanted to have their sons especially trained either for two things. There would be, of course, the need for people to go into careers in the church, meaning a familiarity and necessity of understanding Latin and Greek and basic mathematics and understandings of music and speech and medicine. I mean, a very wide-ranging understanding of all the different kinds of disciplines of thought that would go into the service of someone in the church or for someone who's going to go into service of the state. Because remember, as the different entities in Europe, the kings, the queens, and counts, and margraves, and emperors, as we look at them in the coming series of lectures, they are creating more and more sophisticated states where they need more and more military leaders, but they also need accountants and comptrollers and lawyers and physicians. They need trained personnel to run the government offices that are vital to the services of the leader of the state. That kind of, you can't find that kind of personnel. You got to go find it and you got to train it. And increasingly medieval universities are where you go to find that trained personnel. So not only are men going into the university to get more training to be better churchmen, they're also going into the university to get some basic knowledge that will be useful in terms of being able to get a job working in some kind of governmental post for some aristocrat or for emperor or a king. So there's many reasons that people will go to the university, but it is exclusively a male domain in terms of the official university systems that start. They are offered a curriculum of essentially what are called the seven liberal arts. The idea here is that they're going to be offered a smattering of knowledge in all these areas, and that they're going to be then given more knowledge in all these areas so that eventually they have control over things like grammar and rhetoric, speechifying, music, philosophy, theology later on at the higher levels, or law. There's lots of ideas here within the seven liberal arts that your book can fill in the blank there, but the idea is that you're given a very broad range of education, very, very, very important to have a big picture view of education and knowledge, because how are you going to be able to serve either your church or your secular lord, your king, if you don't have a knowledge base of understanding languages or have the common understanding of some of the Greek and Roman classics? That is the education system of the time. It will change, all right? As we move into the future, the curriculum, the language used for instruction, and everything else will change in time. But for now, the early curriculum is essentially a deeper knowledge of Latin and Greek and some of the key concepts of early civilization. That is the focus. If you do want to go on higher, then there are later on, of course, specialty programs in understanding law, medicine, and theology. And those are for the people who are wanting moving on to that master's level and beyond. The people who are going to be the hyper specialists who are going to be serving in their government or their church at some of the highest levels. these are the kind of people that are going to work their way through that higher level education system to get to that job. That's not unlike many people in modern America today. The idea of having higher level education to get to that next certificate, that next job promotion, that next degree that will help you in your long-term career or life goals. Those are the kind of things that I think we would all understand are also here in place. Education is seen as a way to move up and a way to solidify your abilities to take on the next job. Also in this concept, in the 13th century especially, we're creating the idea of what's called scholasticism. There is a famous Roman Catholic clergyman. His name is St. Thomas Aquinas. He is the one who is working through a system of very rigorous philosophy at the time, and his goal is to make sure that you can reasonably understand faith, that there is a way for the human mind to use pure logic and reasoning to come to the conclusions about faith, not simply on the basis of just absolute faith because that's what it says, but using the mind to reinforce that faith and to make it so that when Thomas Aquinas is talking, he's going to create a world where you're going to use a very vigorous intellectual approach to religion and to faith and be able to reconcile the two. Remember, earlier on, St. Augustine of Hippo and St. Jerome had worried that, too much study of the ancient Roman and Greek classics would distract true Christians from their real goal, which is salvation, by reading pagan books. That idea is still on the periphery of some of the thinking in Europe, but it's not nearly as powerful as it used to be. And St. Thomas and the scholastic movement is one of the groups that is going to be undermining that. Okay? And here's a stylized picture of what he was doing. A very, very devout man, a very serious man in terms of trying to pursue that full understanding of faith and to have a full understanding of how reason and logic operate in the world, and that they are not in opposition to each other, but they are in harmony in trying to understand what was going on. Comparing that with some of the earlier philosophies of Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, Epicurus and Zeno, you can see that there's still within the intellectual elite of all these societies an opportunity for especially those who are trained to come up with some very succinct, very powerful understandings of how philosophy works, how it's linked to government, law, and religion. Also what's happening, and this is a picture of Dante Alighieri, all right? One of the other things that's happening is that as there's an expansion of people who are educated, both within the business communities that have been growing in the countryside and in the cities more especially, also within the church, and many of those men who go off and get a smattering of knowledge at the university and then go back home and work on their estates or take up the practice of law back in their areas. There's lots of people who are educated in Latin and Greek and know basically those, but also they're increasingly interested in seeing their own language, their own vernacular language. And that is the idea of taking the local language and making it so that you can understand it. You don't have to read and write only in Latin. You can use your local language. In this case, Dante Alighieri in Italy in the 13th century is going to start to write his famous book, The Divine Comedy, in the local language, in the dialect of the people around him. Not necessarily in Latin, but in the language around him, so that he can reinforce for everyone that you can do this. You can enjoy literacy, you can use it for business opportunities. You don't necessarily have to be university trained in Latin. You can now express yourself in the language you speak and being able to write it. That really opens the door for a lot more communication between people and a lot more business opportunities as well. And Dante will be that segue. Another hallmark, another interesting thing about this time period that we're covering is that with new developing technologies, the rediscovery of some of the Roman ideas of construction are still underway. Many architects and artisans and many different kind of people within the church community are studying old ruins of Roman palaces and previous churches and trying to figure out the next wave, the next generation. This is the beginnings of what's going to be called a movement within architecture of what's called the Gothic, all right? It is a massive scale kind of architecture. You'll see this in many medieval churches of the time. They are trying to be very impressive. They're very expensive to build. They're colossal. They go up high. They look light and airy. And many of them are filled with lots and lots of windows because the architects have figured out how to take some of the massive weight of a big structure and project it out to the side and down. And in that process are able to open up lots of gaps where they can fill it with, in this case, lots of stained glass, windows showing different saints and apostles, really lightening up the church experience. And from a physical point, as one walks into one of these large Gothic churches, you end up having your eye drawn upward towards the light, towards all the different statues and the colored glass, and you're drawn up into this idea that your faith is being projected upwards, and the building around you helps take you up in that process. Now, many of these Gothic churches and cathedrals are still existing in Europe. Many places, lots of them are still in existence. Many of them are massive and fascinating structures to see, and many of them, now coming up on 1,000 years old, are still standing, which is a testimony to the high quality by which they were constructed. So, in this chapter, in this section here so far, we've taken you through several things, including the Gothic architecture and some of the basic understandings of early university thinking. Take a look at your reading and see what kind of reinforcing materials you can find there for this segment. And then, of course, double check to see if there's some of those sample questions that can help you check your knowledge.